We're already live, so we'll go ahead and thank you.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Potluck session 3F. Today we're going to be listening to two inspiring stories on the resource consumption and the circular economy. My name is Amelia. I'll be your session host today. I'm a research fellow here at the University of Melbourne. And I'm joined by two fabulous speakers. Our first speaker will be Layla Iskandar. My apologies, Layla, if I pronounced that wrong. Layla is the co-founder of CID Consulting and used to be the Minister of Environment in Egypt, and has been working with informal waste workers for over 40 years. And Layla is going to talk to us a bit about Cairo's circular economy. So Layla, over to you.
Hi, everybody. So it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Cairo, and I'm really happy to be joining you. I'd like to share the story with you. 40 years ago, I met these people who had come to Cairo 30 years earlier. So they've been doing what they're doing for 70 years, if you can believe that, when Cairo was only 2 million people. They started out on donkey cart, collecting only organic waste and feeding it to animals. But then as the city grew and materials diversified, they also diversified and kept living on the edge of the city in what people call slums or informal settlements. So their story is linked to both materials recovery and urban planning. Over the years, they kept on doing their work and expanding routes and expanding trading partners and setting up a recycling miracle, I call it, so that today they recover 60% of Cairo's municipal waste on a daily basis. They come up to our buildings every single day, pick up our trash, take it back home. It's a family-owned thing, so every family manages 500 flats, and they go back to their neighborhoods, carefully guarding that 1 ton of material because it's their main source of survival, since the city doesn't actually pay them the cost of what it costs to provide us with this service. In waste management speak, door-to-door collection is like the highest level of service. You know, it's like you're being really pampered. Can't have curbside recycling collection. We tried that for 15 years with multinational companies. It was a disaster because people's habits are not the best. For waste pooling sites, because we have stray dogs and cats and scavengers, 30% of the urban poor are below the poverty level, and so on. So back to door-to-door collection. So for years, what we've been trying to do is to document their work. This is not a unique situation. There are people who do this kind of work in millions of cities all over the world. In fact, in 2008, we all met in Bogota, and we got together with 100 cities to say, we're here, this is what we do, and everybody's trying to quantify it. So while formal contracting for waste management services often goes to formal companies, they cannot keep the city clean unless they subcontract either formally or informally with these people. It's an army of people, at least 250,000, joined, of course, by even poorer people, scavengers and roamers. So the people I'm talking to you about are not scavengers or roamers. This is an occupation that they have inherited from parents and grandparents and have been doing for 70 years. Today, they're all going to school, but still maintaining their hold on the trade, because emerging markets do not always offer their young people with enough gainful opportunities for livelihoods. And because these people are proud of what they do, they are so clever at creating trading partners, recycling streams, and so on. It's a complicated value chain. But here's what happened in 2019 and the crux of the story. The innovation was that multinational companies, because of the hype around plastic in oceans and seas, were now forced to meet EPR obligations, extended producer responsibility targets that the EU and other countries have set for them. So we were approached, because we kind of specialize in waste management, by package of fast-moving consumer group companies. The first was Nestle, And they asked us to design a way of reaching their neutrality targets for plastics. People don't talk very much about waste, or not, in my view, as much as they should, although it constitutes 7% of greenhouse gases and maybe the most, one of the worst, methane. But there are records. People have calculated how much plastic contributes to carbon emissions. So whether it's organic waste and methane or whether it's plastic and fossil fuels, it's all linked to global warming and climate change. When Leslie asked us to design a model, we did our homework. We already knew the value chain, but we had to calculate how much Nestle could recover to reach plastic neutrality. Having done that, we started in 2019, December of 2019, to set up, this is the innovation, that multinationals accepted to work with the informal sector in a formal manner so that we could trace every kilo of PET that moved along the value chain all the way to recycling factories. We had to verify that it actually ended up in a factory where it was recycled, maybe downcycled, never mind, but at least it wasn't left on the ground to burn. So just as just to let you know, we have a huge plastics recycling industry, formal. We have factories, so there's no dearth of those. And these people have been trading with them for years, with contracts, without contracts. It doesn't matter. They go to the pains of collecting from our doorstep and moving up the whole chain, not because they're planning to dump it, but because it makes money at the factory door. Hence, the challenge was to trace it. Now, how do you chase a ton of plastic that's moving in an industry that moves every other kind of material? Paper, cardboard, tin, aluminum, rags, food, everything. So we had to calculate the cost of 1 ton of materials moving and then extract from that 1 ton, we weighed in the field. Of that 1 ton, how much is PET? We had national numbers about waste composition. Anyway, we got to the calculation of how much it would cost Nestle to pay for the recyclers to divulge. They weren't doing anything new, but they weren't going to tell anybody about it because they were so scared that they might be taxed for it. So we had to give that guarantee, and to trace and document, we set up an IT system. We had a platform where everybody who agreed to get onto this track and trace system for Nestle agreed to open up an e-wallet and send SMSs on their cell phones. It doesn't have to be a smartphone, all the way up to the factory door. So to do that, you had to sign up people, take them to their telephone provider in their local neighborhoods. Remember, I said slums, which is not the easiest thing in the world to do. And then to register them on the internet, the phone provider, to show them how to send a special SMS to a specific number when they sold material to the next step in the value chain. And the person who bought from the prior step had to confirm the sale. And in addition to all of the IT platform documentation, we had a field team that was there at every transaction just to make sure there was no fraud involved. So the data that this endeavor has yielded is that we now know what it costs to recover 1 ton of materials, PET only so far, for any multinational wishing to achieve plastic neutrality. The people who have been onboarded onto the platform have been able to recover 20,000 tons of PET per year. They can recover double that because we have invoices of the materials they deliver to the factory. That's our verification for the last step. And it shows actually that they deliver a lot more than what Nestle requires to reach neutrality. Now, we did a lot of lobbying with the Ministry of Environment. They were very receptive to the notion. formalizing and recognizing these people, because there was a landmark law that was drafted in, actually approved by Parliament in 2020, a new waste management law that said, thou shalt recognize and formalize informal waste workers. And the Ministry of Environment set up a platform where all these people were invited to register. They didn't. So we just hired one young person with a laptop, and we actually herded them to the place where that young person was sitting in their neighborhoods. All has to happen there. And we registered them. So that was a first step. Then more lobbying with the Ministry of Social Protection. And there we said, we want to obtain a social insurance number. You have to have a national ID number. That's vital to get a cell phone even, and a social protection number for these people. That's ongoing. Then to the Ministry of Manpower and Labor to say, when COVID hit, the government of Egypt gave out stipends and support to everybody who had an occupation on their national ID number. But believe it or not, these people were called no occupation on their IDs. So they didn't get anything. So we said, how can we continue that way? And there a new conversation started by saying, we want to change their occupational name to recycler. The reason we didn't choose waste collector or waste worker is because, first of all, women don't go out and collect. So we would have excluded women, number one. Number two, really, they don't come up to our doorsteps in this huge megalopolis of 20 million to collect. They do it to recycle. If they weren't going to recycle, they would never consider the trouble and the hard work and the low-paid occupation of what they do. So they keep our cities clean, protect us from cholera. And finally, the Ministry of Manpower said, fine, we will do it. So there are institutional things that are happening at the ministry level, but more importantly, the money they're making. It's a top up on top of what they get for trading the materials. We don't interfere. We don't want to know how much they're making, what the prices are. They are exposed to also terrible fluctuations in the price of plastic, and it's all linked to the price of oil, of course, and global markets. So they don't understand what's happening, but they know that they can't trust fortunes and that they have to be very careful and get the best price. We have organized them in clusters. So the compactor is the head of the cluster. He has in his tail like about 60 collector recyclers and about another 10 intermediate traders, and they're free to send to whichever factory. Just to link this to urban planning and informal settlement upgrading, these people in Cairo who have been doing this for 70 years live in 6 neighborhoods. And if you look at the map, I've included it in the paper I sent, the location of the 6 neighborhoods surround Cairo, 6. And in fact, they act physically, this is urban planning, spatial stuff, they act as transfer stations. But because they are places where thousands of tons of municipal waste end up, and it's sorted 4 women for every ton, they are unseemly places. And of course, these people have for years been exposed to untold health hazards because they sort it manually in their homes. But it's that 1 ton of family money, materials that they cherish and protect so much that they have resisted for many years consolidating it into a facility. Because if they did that, then how would they know that the materials they got from our homes actually are going to be credited to their account when it's traded? Very complicated. So that's what we're trying to do. But we've come to the conclusion that there's a need to look at these slums as transfer stations and work on ways to ask residents to source segregate, if nothing else, but start with 2 waste streams, organic, non-organic, and change the vehicle that collects and take the organic somewhere else before it comes to the neighborhood. That would cut down health hazards by God knows how much. I haven't calculated it, but the organic fraction is the main source of the hazards. In that neighborhood, from 1983 to now, we started with 8 compactors, granulators, washing machines, agglomerators, centrifuge. Today we have in each one of the neighborhoods, particularly in Mukatam, which is the largest, we have about 500. The first 8 came into the neighborhood through a donor, Oxfam. But the other hundreds, and if you multiply with the 6 other neighborhoods, from their own savings. So it's an industry that has grown with hard labor, savings, ingenuity, and investment. So they're business people. They shouldn't be perceived as poor, because definitely they're not poor in their business savvy and in their knowledge of how to get materials. When the multinationals came in 2003, their access to materials was severely obstructed, huge barrier. So they devised ways of getting it from other provinces and other cities all over the country. Now they're back. The multinational experience was an unhappy one for the city. We're back to recognizing door-to-door collection for emerging market cities. Mega cities like Cairo have to have door-to-door collection. It's for now, a transition phase until we source segregate, until we change our habits, until our education improves, blah, blah. That is the way to save the city from cholera and other diseases. So in a nutshell, what we've learned is that first they can learn. Everybody's on their phones, sending SMSs, receiving their money on their e-wallets, no problem. No barrier there. That their work together in a cluster, now we've been at this for 2 years, has begun in a very small way to breed a little bit of trust among the one cluster. That's a key thing in designing these things, because they will betray, if you like, any trader they've been working with for an extra 10 cents. It's that kind of a marginal existence that the temptation of 10 cents more per kilo will drive them to betray their group. Now it's not happening, not as much. And so we're hoping that maybe this will breed the seeds of some kind of formal organization down the line. We don't know. And so another lesson learned is that, okay, I've been doing this for 40 years, and all of the donor-driven programs that have come in over 40 years, and boy, there have been many, have always predicted what should happen, and they put in these log frames and results-based work plans. It never happened, never. You cannot predict what will happen as a formal body, development institution, because this is an informal sector, because the world changes, because prices, because of global things, because of local industry, because of laws that change about importing resin, a host of things that it is so difficult to break. You have to shepherd the story until, hand in hand, you take it to where it's good for them and good for the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. That was a very interesting talk, and I sort of a few points that I was picking up was about, how this is a lot about changing the frame of informality, and informality as a strength for the city. And I liked what you said about the changing the slums from that label to like waste transfer centres, and relabeling, these aren't poor people, they're actually very business savvy, and anyone can learn. And I think that was a really beautiful way to frame what is, as you said, a very sort of complex, multi-layered problem. And really, very interesting innovation and very inspiring story. So thank you very much. Now we're going to move on to Oliver Harman. So Oliver is a cities economist at the International Growth Centre at the University of Oxford. And he works with emerging city mayors on economic policy. And he'll be talking to us today about some solid waste management and super pollutants in emerging cities. So Oliver, over to you.
Thank you, Amelia, and thank you, Layla. That was super fascinating. I knew that you were going to speak on informal aspects of waste collection. So I almost included none, or I took all of it out of my slides, but I have added a couple of bits in because some of your comments triggered a couple of thoughts on my side. So I'm just gonna put this up and I'm gonna go big. Okay, I hope that's all coming through. Lovely. So yeah, today I'm going to talk to you about urban solid waste management and super pollutants in emerging cities, and particularly looking at evidence and action for change. Prompted a little bit by Layla there. I did have this and I previously took it out, but I think it's quite an interesting slide and won't do the actual quiz, but it's a useful indication, looking at the average e-waste picker or recycler in Ghana or Accra, how much does the average e-waste picker earn? And I've only got 20 minutes, so I won't dwell too much on this, well, compared to a civil servant. But, they actually earn 4 times the amount of a civil servant in Accra. So you can see how actually this is a lot of, informal waste can be very, very lucrative, despite the often kind of negative connotations that people associate with that. I also like to add this in, I realize that I'm speaking from Oxford or London, and it's very easy to talk about some of the issues and challenges or with some of the opportunities in emerging country cities. But this is a bin that took me 12 months to get off my local council after emailing and haranguing them for a long, long time. So this is for organic waste, right? This is an issue that is happening everywhere. It just has kind of specific circumstances that I think are a bit different and unique to emerging country cities, but I always like to start with that. I also like to start with hopefully what you're going to take away from the presentation. First of all, there's 3 takeaways I'm trying to get through. One is that waste management in emerging cities is an issue of increasing global climate importance. I think that also, one of the themes here in this Innovate for Cities is about, localizing climate action. And I think one of the best ways, or is about climate action generally, but I think localizing climate action is one of the best ways of promoting kind of action. So really aligning those local incentives with the global incentives. Innovation supported by research, I think, is a powerful way to scale up these solutions. And that's a key theme of this global research and action agenda. And of course, I looked at our dear moderator's research, and Amelia has some similar stuff talking about the power of city-to-city learning, identified as a key enabler in local level engagement. So I thought, there we are. I'm saying something, and our host has said something very similar in her much more impressive thesis. So yes, that's hopefully what you're going to take away from today. And which I suppose is broadly, why should I care? What would I do, and how can I do it? I think an always useful way to frame these things. I quickly looked through the previous, the feedback from the previous cities and climate change, and this, waste does come up a bit, particularly kind of as a priority research gap on waste and energy, and this kind of need to bring these climate policies with co-benefits. And I think solid waste management is one of these, right? And also kind of similar, this art that some artist was doing with e-waste. So you can see that it is something that is becoming more, increasingly coming on the agenda. But I think a lot more, research and action needs to happen in it. Just finally, before, the motivation of this paper really is from policymakers in emerging cities. Often when we speak to policymakers, urban solid waste management is one of their top priority issues. It's the aspect that, as a local government minister or as a mayor, your citizens are seeing every day. And I think it's really important. It's a key indicator of kind of governance focusing, government delivering well. My apologies, it's very early here and my brain is still waking up. So on that first message, waste generation is increasing with urbanization and rising incomes, particularly across the globe, but it's particularly, I think, driven in developing country cities. And we're expected to see global waste increase by 70% over the next 30 years, which is quite considerable, I think. And I'm going to go through, some of these different aspects. So for example, this is in India, current studies suggest a rate of waste generation is requiring a landfill site equal to the area of its 3rd biggest city in the next 20 years. So they're talking, this is the equivalent of Bengaluru will, you know, the size of that is going to hold the next 20 years worth of waste, and many of that is not being, you know, deposited in an environmentally safe manner. And similarly, this is a graph of waste generation in Kigali, and we can see here, well, I think the most important thing is its waste generation is increasing at 4 times its rate of population growth. So as the incomes in a lot of emerging cities are rising and as consumption is rising, along with that, their waste generation is increasing at a much faster rate, let's say. And yeah, this is the same sort of story in Kampala as well, where you can see waste almost doubling over 6 years. And this causes a lot of local externalities. So it's causing a lot of, yeah, kind of poor environmental issues at the city level. And I think this is where you can really drive, yeah, this action for change, because it's a climate issue that people really sense and is very much local to them. Often with emerging cities, the kind of you know, carbon emissions and the like are kind of they're felt sort of in 20 years time maybe, or at least the major consequences. But I think the some of these local externalities are felt very quickly now, and you see this with issues around air pollution, particularly black carbon, and this is where the super pollutant aspect comes in. So you see black carbon emissions are, and this is from burning waste. Sorry, I should be clear. This is yeah, from the open burning of waste, which is one of the most common ways of disposing of waste in emerging cities, and you get, you know, considerable air pollution, both on yeah, which is like very bad, of course, for people's health with through their lungs and the like, but also in terms of, yeah, kind of, it's black carbon very strongly absorbs sunlight. So you get huge kind of local warming increases as well, much more higher than a carbon dioxide equivalent, and much higher than actually methane, which is another dangerous pollution, super pollutant. So this is really driving a lot of issues at a local level. Methane is another one, particularly open landfill is, you know, a lot of methane comes from that. I think, yes, there we are, 60% of municipal solid waste generates about 60% methane, and this also, yeah, captures heat at a very local level, and can cause kind of considerable issues on local air pollution. And, you know, this is an example of a landfill gas collection system in Wisconsin in the US, but a lot of emerging cities don't sort of have this. They just have yeah, open landfill, and it's often quite unsanitary as well. Further issues, I thought this was a quite good image of Chicago, although it is by no means an emerging city, but it kind of, you know, you see this local heat getting trapped, because methane is, what is it, 84 times more polluting than carbon, and it also, yeah, it has this kind of ability to trap heat at a lot more localized way. So it can have considerable consequences there for kind of productivity and heat stress, and, yeah, ultimately death of people in cities, I think. Urban, you know, flooding is another big one as well. Drains often blocked is something we see quite a lot of the emerging cities, and, you know, you see this localized flooding and choking of drains, and this is something that, you know, in our conversations with Mayor Soa of Accra, he was saying was a considerable issue. And similarly, you know, I think I've touched upon this, some of the health and welfare issues of you know, these pollutants leaking into the soil and making their way into the human body and things like that. And there's a lot of evidence that's quite striking about that. And finally, you know, poor solid waste management, as Leila indicated, you know, you're losing out on a quite considerable revenue source as well. You know, a lot of emerging country cities, governments spend a lot of money on their solid waste management, about 19% of their budgets. But they often don't recover barely any of these costs, because they're not either engaging correctly or well with the informal workers, or it's just been kind of completely lost through, and everything goes through to you know, through to landfill. So they're not actually being able to segregate any of these streams. But in addition to those, you know, those local externalities, there are global externalities, which is why I think this is that fits into that nice kind of co-benefit area for climate action. And again, you don't have to kind of look through this graph in detail, but this is the methane emissions, you know, in different continents, and you can see that actually, you know, in areas where a lot of emerging cities are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia as well, you know, there's quite considerable methane emissions, a lot more than if you would look at the similar ones for carbon. And Layla said kind of 7% of greenhouse gas emissions of methane. I've seen sort of figures around 3.4, but 3 to 4%. But yeah, it's a considerable and unrecognized and under-researched contributor, I think, to kind of a greenhouse gas. And yeah, it's a lot more powerful, right? It lingers a lot. It's a lot shorter lived, but it's a lot more intense in that time. So we really feel the consequences of it quite considerably. And because I think it's important to add here, because organic waste is often one of the main contributors to that methane, and because of the way that emerging country cities are, a lot of their waste stream is organic, like 70 to 8% of solid waste in developing countries is organic. And you compare that, it's a much, much lower level in wealthier cities. So, this is going to be an increasing problem that I think needs increasing action. And, the kind of plastic story, I think, is always useful to add in here. This is the Great Pacific garbage patch, right? I think that's another reason why people should be kind of caring about this, because a lot of particularly Asian rivers, are polluting kind of the global waterways, and that also gets into our food streams and things. So I think that's the kind of the why and the how, but I think now this is what, the what does kind of some of this cutting edge research say? And I've asked Amelia just to kind of let me go through as much of this as possible, and then I'll stop on time so we can have some time for Q&A. But I think there's a number of sort of policy questions that people are looking at, and how to get citizens to produce less waste, how to get them to pay for more waste disposal, account for their personal waste behavior, change their behavior, get value out of waste. And these are questions that have been asked to us from emerging country governments, and there's a lot that economics can help in this. And I think this is where this innovation aspect can come in, where we can trial studies, where we can try and change attitudes and change behaviors using some kind of useful economic concepts around the willingness to pay, around the kind of individuals free riding off the behaviors of others, and around sort of information and norms. And I think this ties in nicely with what Layla was saying, in that you were talking about kind of the door-to-door collection aspects, and curbside collection doesn't necessarily work. And I think there are aspects that we can see how we can innovate on these margins to get people to change their curbside behavior, so that then we can move towards that kind of the kind of method of collection that is often seen in kind of more developed cities. So I think the first thing, and now we're moving on to text rather than pictures, so I do apologize, but looking at this marginal cost of producing waste, we need to look at how we can increase it, so how we can use incentives to get citizens to change their behavior, right? And that's give them financial incentives as waste generators to reduce their waste creation. I think one of these examples is kind of using more pay-as-you-throw methods. And I think this is a really telling graph, right, that shows developing cities versus developed cities. In developing cities, a lot of the ways that waste management is paid for, this is for, I think broadly, mostly kind of formal evidence. So we can have a discussion about that afterwards. But it's through no fees or through lump sums. So no matter how much waste people produce, they're not necessarily going to be. They're not incentivized to reduce their waste. While you look on the right-hand side in developed cities, a lot of it have these specific duties, such as pay as you throw, where for every extra gram of waste you produce, you are charged more. And putting those sort of systems in place can really can get people to change their behavior. And this is just one example from Bo City in Sierra Leone, where it was all about kind of the extent to which you would pay for the kind of size of bin and your amount of and your collection. So rather than just getting collected whatever time, this would come in. And this was actually, this was engaging with kind of the informal sectors to drive this. I think it's kind of an interesting example. It doesn't necessarily have to be high tech. It can be just done on sort of bin sizes. But people really started to understand the cost of waste production and change their behavior as a result. And I think there is a willingness to pay. Often what we see in a lot of the evidence and also the rhetoric is that people aren't willing to pay for their waste, but actually even in low-income areas in Accra, there is fee provision that is used by the Kaya Bola, which is like a kind of informal network of waste collectors. And so even at low income levels, there is this willingness to pay if the kind of service is provided. And there's similar interesting evidence from some work we've done in Hargeisa that shows households actually pay 3 times the amount on waste collection than they do in property tax, which kind of really shows that even in some of these lowest income areas, that waste collection is quite important. I think the question of segregation is always quite important, is critical as well to this discussion. And there's some interesting work looking at, because of the nature of kind of the waste collected, very few are able to extract this value further along the chain. And I think this is where there's an interesting difference between kind of the formal and maybe the informal. The informal are often able to, as Leila was saying, go door to door and find each aspect of the waste stream and kind of get value from that. But the formal is often collected as one kind of unsegregated mixed waste batch, which means that it's unable to be processed further, or if it is, it costs quite a lot of money to do so. So I think it's really important that cities look at how to segregate waste kind of at curbside or at doorside to kind of be able to get this value back from it. And I'll touch upon this in a slide in a moment. But again, this is kind of interesting, the kind of tension between developing cities on the left, where very few cities have any form of formal separation in place. And on the right, developed cities, you see a much higher level of higher separation, which allows cities to generate generate value from their waste. I will not go on this for the benefit of time. I wanted to touch on this because it's linked with what Leila was saying. The value of mixed waste is often close to zero or negative, but if you can segregate it, you see, for example, you can get glass, it's priced at £44 per ton, paper and cardboard at 102. Once you actually bring out the different aspects of that's in the kind of your typical waste stream, the sum of the parts is actually considerably greater than the whole. And that is my my kind of going against Aristotle. Aristotle used to say, the sum of the parts is less than the whole, but no, the other way around. But anyway, that's the crux of it, is that you can generate a lot more from these once you can split out these waste streams. And I put this extra slide in here now because I think, Leila, what you were saying about the difficulties in the kind of increasing and decreasing values of waste. And I thought this was talking about plastics being linked to the oil markets. This is some evidence looking at cardboard, right? Which I was quite shocked about when I was doing this research. In 2019, cardboard was valued at $28 per ton. And that was down from $70 per ton in 2017 and $171 per ton in 2017. It was 70 in 2018. That's quite a shocking decrease in the value if that's what your livelihood is depending on. We're not talking about 10 or 20%. We're talking about like multiple differences.
Yes. I'm just giving you a 2-minute warning.
Cool, thank you. What shall I pick? This was the intention of these presentations, to see how much I could get through on some of these aspects. What I will touch upon, because it links with what Leila was saying, is this final study here, which is showing how you can change behaviors at the curbsides, and looking at this kind of the economics around information norms and incentives. And this is a study done in Delhi, trying to change actions of the household. And what it provided citizens with information. It provided citizens with information and social norms, and provided citizens with information and incentives. And at the baseline, so initially, before all this happened, only 5% of citizens were segregating at the like curbside level, which, as I said earlier, is kind of, I think, very important for both generating waste and to kind of generating value from waste. It's very important to do, and also to kind of make these kind of waste markets work well, and to kind of show citizens that local government is working for them. But after this intervention, we saw 50% were segregating. So often just providing citizens with this information after 1 week kind of went from 5% to 55, and that stayed after 5 weeks. But the most important was kind of this information and incentive. So it was I went up to 62% of people were segregating, and this stayed at about over half maintained that because they were given a small financial incentive to do so, which links back to the kind of first point I was talking about providing these economic and financial incentives. So yeah, that's broadly kind of what I wanted to touch upon. I think I've hopefully covered those sort of 3 takeaways quickly in the time. So yeah, it's that, it is a crucial issue of increasing global climate importance, and because it balances these two local issues and global issues, I think it's a really good way of promoting action. And I think there's a real, as I've showed by some of the studies today, I think it's a really useful way to kind of have research and policymakers working together. So this is part of a paper that we're working on at Cities That Work on, with the same title, right? Urban Solid Waste Management and Super Pollutants in Emerging Cities. And it talks upon what I've been, it writes on what I've been talking upon today, and draws a lot about that. So this is just to say, if people are interested in having that piece when it's hopefully shortly published, please reach out. Or if these are kind of issues that you feel are pertinent in your city and that you want to kind of have further research or engagement on, please get in touch, of course. Back to you, Amelia.
Thank you, Oliver. That was great as well. It was interesting to see the different perspective, linking what Layla was talking about, those very localized solutions to sort of a global stage. And I thought it was quite interesting as well how you drew parallels between the more developed cities as opposed to the more developing cities, and how that pay as you throw. I've never heard that term. I think it's quite catchy. I like it. But quite interesting to see the juxtaposition between the two, and how, we sort of, I think as the West or the developed world seems to think that flow of information is one way, but I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. And that city to city learning, I think, was really resonated with your talk. So thank you, that was great. So now we're going to shift into the Q&A stage of the talk. And I do encourage anyone who's listening in to throw in questions on whatever chat platform you've got. I've got about 3 on the go, and I will be keeping an eye on them, so please throw in your questions there. I noticed during our session that we had a question from Diana that was directed to Layla, and I saw that Layla did respond to it in the chat. For the benefit of those listening in on the audio, I might repeat the question, Layla, and have you respond to it verbally, if that's all right. So from Diana, she's thanked Layla for the presentation and is asking, are there future plans to work with the waste collectors housing to improve it in some way that also benefits their jobs? Thank you, Layla.
Yeah. Yes, there are, but the complications is that mega cities land is scarce and expensive. So you have developers wanting to sell gated community villas and compounds rather than house poor people from slums to better. However, we have one case where we had a flood right before COVID that killed 15 people in one of the 6 neighborhoods, and their homes were destroyed. They knew that they lived in a floodplain, and the government actually decided to do this amazing thing, build apartment blocks for them, and that's half a kilometer away where they can see the materials. They have actually begun, it's going to be done in 6 months, allocating each family, there are 1,000 families that are impacted by this, a sorting area, and right behind that sorting area, still within sight, I mean, this is amazing, government understanding the importance of people wanting to guard the materials because it's their livelihoods. Behind the sorting area is a place to raise animals. I mean, it's not the best way to deal with organic fraction, but that's a transitional phase because these people for 70 years have been raising pigs on the organic fraction. So until our composting plants reach a higher level of efficiency and better management, because of course waste is still not source segregated, this will continue to be the mode. However, it's one of the 6 neighborhoods. It's the smallest one, 1,000. The largest neighborhood has about 5,000 families with scarcity of land. We're still discussing what best can be done to keep them sorting in a hygienic manner, not have them live in the middle of the organic fraction of the waste and the animals that they raise, but still keep their foothold on this trade, because I promise you, if they didn't do what they were doing, we would have a horrendous problem in the city of Cairo, us, the people who live in the city, not the people who handle its waste.
That's a great response, Layla. And I was just thinking on the back of that, and also noticing we haven't got many questions coming through, so please put them in the chat. But on the back of that, I was wondering, you've sort of touched on how waste management not only has implications for sort of resource production and reuse, emissions, but also human health. I wondered, from your perspective, are there any major messages or techniques that you're using to lobby policymakers and identify these real, cross benefits of, engaging the informal sector to help manage waste? Are you using that angle as a way to demonstrate all the multiple benefits that come from managing plastic waste?
Yes, actually, we have now, thanks to the many years of working with these people, but now officially because of the EPR scheme with Nestle and Pepsi, we can officially go to government and say, hey, you know what? Every ton of materials, we don't call it waste, that emanates from our homes generates 7 jobs for every ton. Now, for a policymaker trying to increase employment rates in their country, this is a very important number. 7 direct jobs and 10 indirect jobs in the city of Cairo, and I know in Mumbai they have the same rate. Actually, also in Latin America. So 7 jobs direct, 10 indirect. Hey, that's an important number. Then we trace the materials. We have been doing that for years, and can go back to government and say, and here's the number of tons the people who are currently doing this recover. And these tons translate into dollars. And these dollars translate into input for industry. So if these people stopped doing what they're doing, you know what? It's industry that would suffer. And there are more jobs there, and there's more money invested there, and there's exports and trade and what have you. So these are the numbers we're working on to lobby for a new perception of what a good system would be for emerging cities, very different from what works in the north. It is so difficult to incentivize people based on what they throw out in their bin, or to even determine collection fees based on that. We, like Oliver said, it's flat fees for now. The complicated financial systems of doing that in emerging cities, we're still not there for now. And so all these numbers provide a basis for the dialogue with government, not just to say, hey, these are poor people, livelihoods, income, kids going to school. Okay, that's the one track, but it's strengthened by this other track of jobs and investments and a value chain for an entire industry.
And that's a really good system thinking approach. And you've also sort of touched on a few other issues around data and transparency. And something that really struck me in your talk is how good your monitoring system seems to be, and how you make sure that you've got the measurement of, who's doing what, and make sure there's no fraud, within the waste collection, so that you make sure you've got those numbers. And what was it, 7 jobs per ton? That's very impressive. I might
sorry. Just to add very quickly, in this business of numbers, it's very important to avoid multinationals greenwashing, because many of them will do that if they're all trying to meet EPR obligations right now. And there are so many ways of claiming that you have recovered the materials you've put into the market. But if you don't have a track and trace system that's tight and documented, then really you cannot, as a multinational packaging company, claim in all honesty that you are meeting your obligations. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's a great point. And we're finding that a lot with, any climate resilience work needs to be underwritten by a very robust data set. So that's fantastic. I'm seeing some questions coming through the chat now. Got one from Emily, which might be more relevant to Oliver, I'm thinking. So Oliver, Emily is asking us, how do we address the issue of privilege in waste management? She says that it seems as though many developed countries have an out of sight, out of mind model or attitude, and perhaps just Australia and inner city Melbourne. And Emily, as someone who lives in inner city Melbourne, I can agree with you there. So this sort of mindset, she thinks, prevents them from taking substantial action in waste management reduction. So Oliver, do you have any comments to
that? I don't really know. I think that like last slide that ended, I think information can be like incredibly powerful, right? And I think that kind of shows in one of those last slides. I shared that like in terms of changing attitudes and behaviors, right? I think that can be quite crucial, and in tying sort of the some of those local externalities to like individual action. I think that's like letting people know that there are considerable consequences to their like poor practices at a household or individual level, because I don't think people often make that connection, right? I think it's a very natural thing to want to dispose of our waste in like the lowest cost way, which is why I think we see such prevalence of open burning, right? I think that's like the classic example. It has very limited individual costs, but has huge like local or cost. It has a much larger collective cost. And I don't think citizens don't necessarily make the connection between like the flooding every year in Accra and the the poor waste management practices, right? Throwing litter away or kind of or leaving it out on the sides of the street, and similarly these issues of air pollution I touched upon, or kind of open dumps leaching into the like the food and water kind of streams, right? I think that's quite powerful, and in terms of knowing that information, and I spent a long time researching for this paper, and it took me a while to make these connections. So there's no way people who don't think about waste necessarily are going to make those same connections. And I think that it's important to have that information to facilitate that kind of behavior change, because otherwise it does become very much out of sight, out of mind. I mean, it's not well, in a lot of kind of emerging cities, you see the kind of the waste, the open dumps are often in or around the poorest neighborhoods, who are those who don't necessarily, who can't kind of push back on these things. So often people do just it does just become that out of sight, out of mind. I think the other thing, as well as the kind of health, is this aspect on value from waste, letting people know that ultimately their poor kind of waste management or materials management, I like that, Layla, it's not waste, it's materials, but their poor kind of behavior is ultimately affecting like the wider services that they get at the city level, because the city is having to is not getting value from waste, is a good way getting through to people's wallets. If they change their behavior, then maybe they will have to pay less in property taxes, because that's how it's otherwise getting funded. I think that's quite important, and somewhat linked to that, but I just wanted to kind of touch upon it based on what Layla was saying. the potential for these materials to be used as inputs for economic gain is quite considerable. And I think, to be used as materials rather than waste is quite considerable. We see in Accra, there's a lot. Ghana is one of the main e-waste recyclers, I suppose, in both probably formal and informal. Ghana and Nigeria, I think, are where a lot of our mobiles and batteries and things go, and there's a considerable kind of value add that is now happening as these materials are finding their ways back into value chains in these cities, and manufacturing areas are using them to produce new products. And I think also kind of being able to highlight some of these wider benefits is quite important. I'll stop there. Leila, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to say that there are cases in industrialized countries that have the ability to track and trace complex data sets to reduce the fee for service when people reduce the waste they generated throughout. You really need to be a high-tech country to be able to trace how many bins people put out and say, okay, you were so good last month that we're going to reduce your fee, or last year or whatever. But they're few. But there are examples of cities where people have incentivized their population to reduce their waste, and the incentive is, we'll reduce your fee for collecting it. Now, in our context, in emerging markets, we're at the point where we're asking people, we're trying to incentivize them to put their waste in a safe place, either to hand it directly to their waste collectors or to put it in a municipal bin and not to leave it on the ground. So that in itself would be a major step towards improving the hygienic situation in the city. So it's a different context between industrialized and emerging cities.
Yeah, lots of really interesting points there from both of you, but something that's really resonating with me is that reframing waste. It's not waste, it's a material, it's a valuable commodity, if we want to use sort of economic terminology. And I think there's a lot of opportunities there to, in that reframing, sort of change the way people perceive it as well. And I like what you were saying there, Leila, is like, put your waste in a safe place, like keep it safe, it's valuable. And it's important as well, for what you were both talking about with waste separation. And if we do that at the the household level, that has huge implications further down the chain. I do have another question for Oliver. Sort of like building on what you were saying earlier about how the way that we can rethink certain approaches to waste management, especially in more sort of developed countries. You talked about this specific duty in this pay-as-you-throw model that I touched on before. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how that pay-as-you-throw model might apply to other cities, and what the role of the local government can be in facilitating. Do you think that model will work, I suppose, in more developed cities, and how?
Yes. Yes. So, right, like pay as you, as I was saying, like pay as you throw is definitely more used in developed cities, but there have been a number of like cases where it has been shown to be successful in more developed cities, and it doesn't have to. I don't think the level of kind of finance has to be, or the financial level has to be, too high or too low. Just like a small amount can kind of make people start to internalize the cost of their actions. And I think, yes, across, the globe, there are different contexts, but I think there is like something intrinsic to our human behavior that you can use these kind of incentives to alter. And I wouldn't be a good economist if I didn't believe that. So maybe I've spent too long in the field, but yeah, there are. I think it is crucial to have it as this kind of, speaking about the role of local government. I mean, it's crucial to have it capacity relevant, right? And I think that's where sometimes these things can fall down. You know, that first example I showed you with the different kind of bin sizes in Bo City and Sierra Leone, you know, initially 30% of the city's budget was going towards waste management, but just by kind of, and this was, door-to-door collection with youth groups, right? Just by kind of changing these bins, citizens were sensitized, and they had this awareness raising to the kind of importance of this, you know, the long-term success of their city by kind of changing their waste behavior, but also, you know, there were these kind of linked jobs to it. And I think, you know, a lot of cities would be able to kind of charge, you know, or be able to charge different prices for different bins. And I think similarly, you know, there's some examples in the Philippines where it's just a matter of kind of stickers on bin bags, right, that you kind of that you paid for, and these stickers were purposely priced, you know, much below the value that much below the actual value, but it was just, again, that kind of initial step to change behavior. And I think there's one other really nice example in Mozambique, you know, another kind of low-income context where some of the cities started tying the price of like waste collection to electricity consumption. So while this isn't necessarily a one-for-one thing that's going to go at the same way, you know, you started to understand which households, you know, if you're consuming more electricity, then you're probably also producing a similar amount of waste, and it allowed kind of the local government to get in and kind of price based on consumption. I think it was quite successful in many of these cities in terms of both financing their kind of waste collection, but also changing the makeup of this waste, and doing it through these different kind of organic and inorganic streams, I think is quite important as well, so that you can both, you know, generate value from the inorganic aspect through composting, and you know, similarly generate value from the organic, whether that be through waste to energy or kind of recycling or putting these aspects. So there's a lot of examples across you know, a number of different emerging cities on how we can kind of use these these kind of financial incentives, whether it would be kind of pay as you throw, and it doesn't have to be kind of cost neutral, but I think it's almost more useful in how you kind of get people to start segregating and start internalizing the cost of their waste or material disposal.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that really responds to what Victoria's asking as well. You know, she's asked both of you, if possible, to expand on examples of incentivizing behavior change. And Oliver, I think you touched on a few really nice ones there, from the stickers on the bags to, you know, other forms of, you know, whether it's a cost disincentive or a cost incentive. You know, I think there are different ways that you can incentivize different forms of behavior change. And also, I think there's also something about the way you communicate that and the sort of the visual triggers that people correspond to, and also that sort of like competition between your neighbours to see how you compare to other people on your street. But I wonder, Layla, from your perspective, you know, are there any examples of incentivizing behavior change, and what implications does this have for compliance with, you know, different waste management interventions in Cairo?
So we launched a national scheme for waste segregation into 2 streams only. Our kitchens are very small. We're not all rich people. So we never planned to ask people to do more than two bins, organic and non-organic. Also, the waste recyclers who collect were very wary that if residents source segregated into 3 or 4 or 5, like you people do in the West, then there's a host of other poor people in the city who might hijack the materials before them. Your maid, your cook, your driver, your porter, everybody in the city knows what waste is worth, and everybody lives in an informal settlement, 60% of Cairo, where there are depots that will buy it from you. Okay, so 2 bins. And we started with low income, middle income, and high income, and we painted the trucks that we're collecting from these pilot neighborhoods into two colors, green and blue, so that people would know the hard work, if you can call it hard, of throwing the trash into two containers was actually being upheld along the line. And then we had the people working in the collection, the waste collectors, or even informal actually, wear a uniform that was colored like the truck, green and blue. And they were the primary agents of the message, along with media messages on TV, radio, and talk shows, and blah, blah, blah. But it didn't last long enough. But we found that actually, you would be surprised, low-income neighborhoods were the best, because it turned out that they already had the habit of source segregating their organic in their tiny apartments, because they were raising little rabbits and chickens in the balcony. And so they knew the value of the material. Not only that, believe it or not, there were merchants who roamed around these neighborhoods, low income, to buy bread that had already rotted, because they were using it to sell to other people who were buying as feed for animals. Look, our mega cities are another world. They're so different from yours. And you need to remember 20 million people in this one city. Similar cities have the same story. And the poor are so ingenious at devising ways of dealing with materials, of finding ways to make money. They don't want to go into drugs or crime. So their alternative is to find gainful income, livelihoods from the materials that we discard, the rich. We just say, here, take these materials and do something with them. So our incentive to reduce waste should be linked to finding ways to keep people working in this sector to recover materials, but in a decent way, in a clean way, in an organized manner that protects them from the hazards of us just casually throwing organic in with the organic. I think it's the one key thing for mega cities to do. And I keep repeating this, just two waste streams. If you do more than that, you're actually hurting the people that you want to keep earning a living and recovering the materials for you.
Such an interesting point, and something I hadn't realized actually is that the two waste streams and how important that is. So thank you. I just wonder on that, you're sort of talking about, the opportunities, the economic opportunities from gainful employment from waste management. And you also mentioned in your talk how that is so related to global markets and, especially with plastic and the price of oil. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how you might protect these sort of informal workers or better support them so that they're not so vulnerable to, global fluctuations in resource prices.
Well, for now, the one thing that I have a concrete experience with is this 2-year engagement with multinationals who have an obligation to recover the tonnage that they've put into your market of a certain material. I mean, look at Amazon and all the cardboard that's been circulating, particularly with COVID. Okay, so who's collecting it? How are all the people who benefit from the Amazon value chain, or the producer, the wholesaler, the retailer, the transport, how are they all benefiting from? Every one of them has to pay their bit. We're not asking them all to physically go and recover, but pay these people who are doing it for them and organize a contractual relationship so that it's organized. So all these pictures we keep circulating of landfills in the South, and there are people who have caused this disaster who are not paying for it. Who are they? How much are they benefiting from it? Okay, pay as much as you contribute to the recovery. Make sure that your recovery systems include these people. I tell you, it's an army. It's like 20 million people already, the ones we have counted. We haven't really counted roamers and scavengers. We've only counted those that we know are in cooperatives in Latin America or here in Cairo. We don't know the full magnitude of the population. Exactly, they say 2%. I think it's more. And so, deliberately organize the system that engages these informal people and formalize them in semi-formal ways. Don't just form companies, it just won't work. And make sure that the people responsible for putting the materials in the marketing, using the materials, benefiting from the sales, pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see a lot of parallels between that and the fashion industry, for example. You know, I think I've seen a video of just the mountains of clothes that get wasted every year, and you know, who's paying for that? You know, big questions.
But that's the first. That's the first thing. That's the easy one. Huh? The harder one is to reduce our consumption. That's another story. Huh?
Well, maybe this is a question for Oliver as well. I know this builds nicely on what Emily is asking is, you know, what's the most effective way of communicating this or, you know, passing information across different contexts to, you know, especially considering the rates of, you know, I would say she sort of talked about literacy and dialect and language barriers and sort of the social capital of the messenger. But I would also say, you know, values and attitudes and what role that plays in how the messages get portrayed and how much that influences the individual's behavior. Oliver, do you have anything to say to that?
So, yeah, the problem with being someone in my position sometimes as a researcher, unless you read someone doing a study on these sort of things, you always feel nervous about just generally pontificating. But for the pleasure of the audience, no, I think that it has been, so one effective way that came to mind when I did see this context, this question, and as you say, you speak about the kind of literacy and some potential kind of language barriers, and I think it is this, you know, like locking into the social norms around these kind of things. I think social norms can be quite quite powerful, and I think there is some good evidence on the power around them. There's some wonderful work happening in Freetown at the moment with they have this kind of cleanest zone competition, which is set by the local government, but and has these kind of criteria, and there's some, you know, some benefits if certain neighborhoods do things like segregate their waste, do things like don't dump, and there's some you know, some pushback if anyone is seen to be illegally dumping and or kind of not complying with these wider forms. And I think having that, you know, that community buy-in or that community desire to get some of these merits that the local government provides seems to be you know, locking into some of these kind of locking into some of these social norms and kind of pushing some differences, because and I also think and I would say this, right, but like context relevant research. I think the cross-country stuff that we've spoken about, that I've specifically spoken about, is very useful starting points, right? I like saying, this worked well in Delhi, this worked well in Accra, this worked well in Mozambique, but it's not particularly difficult to then get someone to go, okay, and how's this going to work in your city, in your context? And that's something we do at Cities That Work, right? That's something that we try and do. We take this kind of cross-country evidence and we take it to somewhere like Cairo and we say, you know, okay, so this is how this is how Delhi got people to segregate waste. Let's run an experiment and see if it works in the same way. Let's run an experiment and see if you know, changing the bin sizes has any effect. And I do, that is to me like truly kind of innovative. And actually I think that's what some of the this Innovate for Cities, one of their they called that. I was looking up what they define as innovation. People often think, you know, innovation is just throw some digital technology at it. But I really think it is, it can be so much more. Right here it is, innovation defined as a new idea, method, or device, or a change made to existing product, idea, or field. Like these can be small iterative changes, seeing what's worked somewhere and applying it to context. And I think you can kind of understand that different nuance, the different aspects of culture that slightly mean that we act in slightly different ways in different circumstances. Amelia, I do have a question for Layla, if I may, and that is on the, I often wonder with kind of the informal jobs around waste collection, what's the like medium term plan with a lot of this, like how they are right now, crucial parts of the waste collection system. But how does public policy like upgrade their skills so that it's kind of there's like a more of a value added job, because as we are urbanizing at such a rapid rate, they are kind of a necessary part of our systems. But I was wondering from the kind of the policy side of things, what people are thinking about how these waste materials collectors or material recyclers can what's the kind of medium term desire for them and their jobs?
So different things for different people. The collectors, the ones who come to our homes on a regular basis, day to day, are now being asked to be subcontracted by large Egyptian companies. We had a very bad experience with multinationals, but we now have a few Egyptian companies, but they are subcontracting at better rates per flat per month than the multinationals were. Also to eliminate the middleman, because even when there were multinationals or local large companies, the idea of a large company is always to simplify the contracting and tendering procedure for the municipality. So it's one contract and you get rid of the headache and say, you go deal with the thousands of people working on the ground. Now we have actually, way back, we divided Cairo into 4 zones. So it's 4 large contracts. Every large contractor is actually directed in policy to hire these people. And the plan, because the law is still new, it was passed last year, the plan is for government to look at the contracts between the prime and these subcontractor informal sector people to ensure that they get a fair fee for service and do not get exploited. Then there's another requirement to provide them with social security. That's not going to happen. It's just too expensive. And the fee that was decided by Parliament, we did our math, it's not going to cover social protection. So we're trying to get them first a social protection number, and then get those who are able to pay for their fraction, and then find other philanthropic sources to supplement that. Now that's the collectors. You have another group along the value chain. You have traders. They're better off, but they rely on these first people to provide them with the materials. So it's very important to protect that first group, the collectors, so that the whole chain keeps working. These traders do not have equipment, trucks, nothing. All they have is a storage space, a warehouse in a slum, and a little capital to buy and consolidate, and then do the secondary sorting of that big pile called plastics into 12 different streams, and that's how they make their money. There's now no clear plan for these people because they're invisible. The third group, and these are very visible, are the processors. Now, these are the people who have compactors, granulators, washers, agglomerators, and centrifuge, and some pelletizers as well. These live in the same neighborhoods where the collectors bring the materials, in the same neighborhood where the traders buy from them, in the same neighborhood where kids go to school and other occupations are emerging. So for these, because they themselves have come to realize the cancer that's spreading in the neighborhood from the plastic fumes emitted by the pelletizers especially, the government does have a major policy plan to move these SMEs, the polluting processors, first out of these neighborhoods with tax credits, with friendly land lease, not clear exactly how much, but there's a plan to dedicate land in industrial zones and to move these SMEs. These SMEs have money, they're ready to move out. The complications of moving a whole bunch of pelletizers or extruders or granulators is another story in our part of the world. We moved a huge community of leather canners. It took us 10 years to do that. Of course, we had a revolution in the middle, an uprising, and we had a different government, blah, blah. There's another story obstructing the speed. This is not going to take as long, but it's not easy. But however, this is the policy plan.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. And I think, we sometimes talk about upgrading, right? And, it's like, how do you generate that kind of next level of value add? And I think, as you say, one thing is maybe bringing these processes in kind of industrial hubs, and that allows, I suppose, some aspect of economies of scale and some aspect of kind of the next stage of the kind of the material stream or the waste stream. Like, how is that going to input into kind of the next aspect of production, and then that's kind of getting traded in the future, right? Because there's got to be some sort of end game to it, I suppose, or at least I hope there's some end game to
what makes it easier, or in Cairo relatively, is that our plastic factories, the plants, are located in discrete and visible industrial zones. So the plan is to move these SMEs, the processors, closer to where they sell the feedstock to these industries. It would be easier to have, because you already have the industrial disposal infrastructure and the trucks and the roads, blah, blah. That's the plan. But as always, the big issue with all of these plans is the land value. Land in the city is a major determinant of how you design your policy.
I might jump in here, if that's all right, Oliver. I just had another question that's come up as both of you were talking, and I think this would be a nice way to wrap up the session as well. Is we've talked a lot about the importance of learning from other cities, and Oliver, you've called it a cross-country approach. I quite like that as well. It's a good way to sort of frame it. So I wanted to get from both of you, if you had one message to send to another city who wanted to, take the approaches you've been talking about and implement it locally, if you had one message for them, what would it be? I might start with Layla, if that's okay, Layla.
Sure. Start enumerating and documenting the waste and the materials recovery people in your city. Their number, their names, their IDs, and the quantities of materials they handle, and translate that into money for your municipality. And then start charging people the right amount of money, the fee, to compensate these people, because for years they've been doing this for the city and not being adequately compensated. And I know this is a very difficult issue, because politicians don't like to upset citizens by raising tariffs and fees. But there are other people who can pay your hotels, your airports, your supermarkets. There are other ways. In Egypt, let me tell you, after our uprising and our whole policy and government changed, we found money in a newly established tax, real estate tax. We didn't have any prior to 2013, but 25% of the real estate tax is now going to go to waste management, whether it is to the government or to the provider, whoever. But I know from my time in cabinet, there's always money somewhere. You just need to find it, and allocate it. And that takes a deliberate decision. That's one. And after you do that, do not consider them outlaws or poor people. They have expertise. Build on it. And then this is the top. That's all easy. The tough part is to redesign your spatial planning of the city, the land you have at your disposal. Here's where urban planning and waste management come together in a manner that keeps them no farther than, say, 20 kilometers from the source of materials, because you're penalizing yourself as a government if you remove them too far. They have to transport it, and look at the price of gas. So be smart. Keep them close to the source of materials, but keep it clean for them and for the city. And then we always come back to the issue of source segregation into two streams, organic, non-organic.
Great message. Thank you, Leila. And Oliver, over to you. One message.
Yeah, I mean, Leila's last sentence was going to be my message, right? I think I think that at the moment in a lot of emerging country cities, there is a solid waste trap, in that no or limited source separation leads to there being a low value of waste, because of this issue around like the kind of the mixed waste. You can't necessarily get these different waste value streams out of it, which then leads to there being kind of no market for waste, right? Because there's no value, you don't necessarily have private enterprise wanting to come in, or it's very costly for local government, which leads to this kind of high disposal cost of it, which then we see this very high kind of landfill use, which is particularly pertinent around sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. You've got like some of the biggest open and unsanitary landfill dumps in the world, which then kind of leads to this low citizen care compliance, because they're not necessarily seeing the whole system work for them, which then further perpetuates this kind of limited separation and segregation. So for me, it's the separation and the source segregation that really drives a lot of the rest of the chain, in terms of both the economics of it and both this like financial viability, but also the environmental aspects of it, because that is where you start to build these slightly, I mean, we're talking about kind of sustainable consumption and production, right? And that's when you start to begin to these kind of more circular economy kind of aspects, because it can become a feed-in material again. And there are a lot of different ways that you can get people to segregate. And I think it's going to be a matter of different different interventions for different cities. But that to me is really where a lot of this starts, and that to me, and not to me, that's where what the evidence says, right? This paper is all about what the academic literature has drawn from, and that's what the literature kind of can really benefit. And I think that's where we need this this kind of research and innovation to understand how to break this cycle in different cities, because I do think a lot of it becomes a kind of a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle if we can get that kind of that segregation in with the waste streams that are appropriate to that to those areas as well. And I think that's where it all starts from.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to slip in one more question, and I'm going to really challenge both of you to put this in 30 seconds or less. You both touched on how waste management is an issue of global importance. I think, Oliver, I took that directly from your slide, so thank you. And we're aware that, the Conference of Parties, the COP26, is coming up in November, where all of the sort of nation states come together to discuss climate change. We've talked about how waste contributes to emissions and the impact that has on, climate change and equity. If you had one message for the leaders at the COP in relation to what you've talked about today, what would it be? 30 seconds or less. Oliver, I'm going to start with you this time. You're on the clock. Go.
I'm on the clock. I think it's this message about super pollutants, right, and how local they can be. If you really want to drive climate action in cities, look at some of these super pollutants where the consequences are very much localized, because emerging country policymakers and governments with limited resources at hand are going to care about their kind of most pertinent kind of problems first. And I think, and there's an argument for kind of the ethics of behind that as well that I won't necessarily get into. But I think that's it. We need to kind of look beyond carbon. I think the kind of methane and black carbon are particularly good areas to drive climate action for change.
Great, thank you, Oliver. And Layla, 30 seconds. You're on mute. I won't cut you off.
Okay, so I just received this report that says this year alone, making and incinerating plastic will release the same greenhouse gas emissions as 189 coal plants. It needs to be peer reviewed, but we're not talking enough about waste at the COPs. Whether it's for methane or whether it's organic, or it's just as serious as fossil fuels. So this is my message. Let's put waste management center stage along with energy reduction and efficiency and transport and agriculture and.
Great. Thank you, Layla, and thank you both. That brings us to the end. Thanks again, and let's keep this conversation going. Feel free to post things in the Knowledge Centre. I'll put the link in the chat. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you to our speakers. That was wonderful.
Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Thanks for hosting, Amelia. Appreciate it. And thanks for the conversation.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Really good. Thank you both. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Enjoy your day. Bye.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.